Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us once again for the Infinite Dial 2021. That sounds like a sci-fi number, John. We're so glad that you're here. It's a strange time for many of us. I think it's our coronaversary. Pretty much 1 year ago that we were all began to really confine ourselves to quarters. It was the last time that I spoke in public. And John, despite all of that, I think we're going to see some oddly surprising things in the Infinite Dial, maybe surprising in a way that you and I didn't expect.
Well, I'm very, very excited to see those oddly surprising things. And as you said, it's been the oddest of years. This pandemic year, in fact, is a year to the day since I think I saw anybody. I've been in this small room pretty much alone, talking to myself day in and day out since then. But happy to be here with you now and very much looking forward to a couple of doses of new information and unmasking some trends in online audio and media consumption.
And just before anyone gets concerned, we will not be unmasking any trends. We will be revealing them. Yeah. For those of you who are wondering, John and I are not in different locations. We are actually face to face, less than 6 feet apart from each other.
Spitting all over you.
Exactly. That was pleasant. So we're going to get started here in just a moment. A couple of housekeeping things. First of all, clean your house. Second, the hashtag for today, if you're going to tweet about this, is Infinite Dial. So we encourage you to use that. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring both the chat and Q&A boxes, but the Q&A box is for questions and the chat box is for chat. I looked those up. If we don't get to your question in the Q&A box by the end, rest assured we will get back to you. We typically get a lot of traffic in those two boxes. So it's time to get rolling here with the Infinite Dial 2021. And as always, before we get started, we like to talk a little bit about the methodology for what we do here on the Infinite Dial. First of all, it is the longest running survey of digital media consumption in America. It's been extant since 1998. And that was I was still a schoolboy then, John. I don't know about you, but I.
Oh, hold on, I'm busy looking up extant.
Extant, yes. I think it's right next to exeunt in your Shakespearean playbook. And we've covered a variety of topics over the last 23, 24 years now, inclusive. Social media, podcasting, digital audio, and you're going to see all of that again today. As a methodology reminder, we always conduct the Infinite Dial using the absolute gold standard of survey research, which is telephone sampling. We do more than half mobile phone sampling to stay in keeping with the percentage of Americans who are mobile phone primary or mobile phone only. And by the way, as a piece of trivia, because we're all about trivia here on the Infinite Dial, the keepers of those stats, the percentage of Americans who are mobile phone only, is in fact the CDC. And they keep those stats in case, I don't know why, John.
That's our first oddly surprising fact.
That's oddly surprising fact number one. So for those of you who are playing a drinking game, there you go. There's an oddly
check off the CDC
fact.
square on your Infinite Dial bingo card.
It's right next to hockey stick growth, which I guess now you can check that one off too. We offer the survey in both English and Spanish. It's weighted to census data. It is as representative and projectable to the U.S. population as we can possibly make it. So as we get started here, we always like to begin with a look at kind of the overall trends in media and technology that filter down and affect some of the other things that we're going to talk about. So here to kick things off with a look at the tech and media space, my friend John Rosso.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. And as you mentioned, media and technology are sort of inextricably linked, one driving consumption of the other. And that's very much true today. So we're going to jump right in now to this section and look at smartphone ownership. First, note that the population base here is U.S. persons 12 plus, and 88%, or about 250 million people, now own a smartphone. It's interesting that after a few years of holding flat, smartphone ownership jumped up a bit this year, and this happened in a year of declining smartphone sales. Global smartphone shipments were down across just about all manufacturers around the world in 2020. The only real exception was Apple, who had a very big back half of last year as the iPhone 12 variants came out and the 5G support came out. But again, after a few years of being flat, smartphone ownership growing a couple of points from 85 to 88% this year. At the same time, tablet ownership continues on its slow downward trajectory, now at 51%, or about 145 million owning tablets. Certainly that's still a very big number, 145 million, but it appears that tablet ownership may have peaked. And now moving from the medium screen down to the tiny screen, let's look at internet-connected watch adoption. So here's smartwatch adoption tracked back to 2017. After a big jump up in 2019, ownership has remained pretty much flat for the past 2 years, now at 18%, or about 51 million people. Now, while there have been all sorts of innovations in watch technology, I guess there just isn't a whole lot of a premium on portability for a time when you're never leaving your house. But if you're never leaving your house, who's better company than Alexa or Siri? This slide shows a smart speaker ownership growth accelerating in 2021, with 33% of Americans 12 plus owning a smart speaker, and that's up from 27% in 2020. So that's a number that's just about doubled over 3 years and is now an all-time high, 33% of Americans owning a smart speaker. As we mentioned at the top, this year has been such an odd one. It's one in which so many of us who usually spend our days in an office have worked from home. Some of us here at Infinite Dial headquarters wondered what impact that might have on the growth of smart speaker ownership. So we looked at the people who told us that they primarily work from home to see if their smart speaker ownership was any different from the general populations. Of the 1,507 people surveyed, 11% say they primarily work from home. Now that tells me that a lot of us temporary home workers probably still identify as office inhabitants. Back to the data though, on the left you see the data point presented on that last slide. That's the 33% of the US population 12 plus. On the right, we're looking just at those who work from home, and the percentage owning smart speakers jumps up to 49. So 49% ownership amongst people who say they work from home. Now, as Tom likes to remind me, correlation is not causation, but this correlation is certainly not terribly surprising.
I'm a little concerned that there's an Infinite Dial headquarters, and I feel like the staff's been keeping something from me. Is that true?
Well, we just assumed you were working from home this whole time.
Okay, there's going to be a sternly worded memo about this, I think.
There will be questions. So now let's answer that question, which smart speaker do people own? So here we see that 24% own devices based on Amazon's Alexa service, 13% use Google Home, and a mere 1% are using Apple HomePod devices. Even though there's been growth in ownership of smart speakers, this mix hasn't changed much in the past year. Google doesn't appear to be catching up, but they're not really losing any ground either. It's important to keep in mind that we're talking about the smart speaker hardware that people are using to access these interactive voice assistants, not which assistants are being accessed the most. It's likely that Siri has significantly more use than the ownership of HomePods suggests, but that use is happening on smartphones, not on the $400 smart speaker. Not only the number of smart speaker owners increasing, but the number of units owned by each household is increasing as well. So this is historical data from 2018 through 2020, showing us the number of smart speakers owned per household. In 2018, the top bar, the majority of households, or 67%, owned just one smart speaker, with only 11% owning 3 or more. 2 years later, in 2020, that 11% had almost tripled to 32%. And the number of households owning just one had declined to 45%. Now, over that same time, the mean number of smart speakers per household increased from 1.7 to 2.2. Now, we use these slides that build because we like the suspense that they create. And now the big reveal, the big bottom bar, which is 2021. Been growth at both the top and bottom of the spectrum, with 34% of households now owning 3 or more devices, 19% owning 2, and 47% owning just 1. The mean number of smart speakers owned increases again to 2.3 units. That orange bar segment that represents just one smart speaker is up a bit from last year, and that's because many of the households that are new to smart speaker ownership fall into this category. And remember, we had over 20% growth last year, so lots of households still just getting their first smart speaker. Looking now at audiobook consumption, really this is my favorite part of the infinite dial. Following on those heady days of 2019, a time that some call the golden age of audiobooks, when about half of the population said they listened, we've seen a drop-off, and now a small rebound to 46%. Still, 46% is 131 million people, so lots of audiobook consumers out there, even in a year with reduced commuting time. Now let's talk about video games. But first, Tom, I would like to show you, in honor of our video game segment, I'm drinking from my Overwatch glass today.
Very nice.
Prove that I'm cool.
Very nice. Well, we all knew that. Yeah. For those of you that missed it, last night, John and I played Call of Duty over Twitch and had over 2 million viewers. So I think some of you might have missed it.
Now have a Twitch, actually, because of it. So let's get into the live streaming of video games. It's really also worth noting that the presenting of this section is the only reason why my kids think that this job for me is cool. So here we're looking at a 3-year trend. On the top, those who have ever watched a live stream video game, that's making a big jump up from 15% to 20% this year. That's a 33% increase, if I'm doing my math correctly. As to the bottom chart, those who have actually streamed their own games, we're steadily growing from 7 to 9 to 10%. With the big increase in viewership this year, we'll be looking to see if there's an increase in people jumping in to stream their own games next year. Who's watching these streamed video games? Well, it's not just teenage boys, as many, including me, seem to think. 23% of men have watched a live stream game, up from 19% last year. But a really significant increase in women watching, up from 11% to 17% this year. And let's look now at the demo breakouts for who's watching. Remember that on a chart like this, you're looking at reach, not share. So this isn't telling us that 38% of the audience is 12 to 34. It means that 38% of those 12 to 34s are reached or say they watch. The biggest move this year is in the increase in the 12 to 34 demo, again at 38%, up from 26% a year ago. The 35 to 54s won't be denied, with those ever having watched increasing from 11% to 16%. And then the older folks, those 55 plus, well, I mean, not so much, with only 4% having ever watched. Maybe they're just busy watching that TV channel that shows MASH all the time. We don't know. MASH. That last slide was watching streamed video games. Let's switch now again to who's streaming and look at the male-female growth, a steady increase on both sides. With men going 10 to 12 to 13% over the last 3 years, but a somewhat higher rate of growth among women going 4 to 5 to 7%. And now looking at the demos for those who actually stream their games live, certainly does skew younger, with those aged 12 to 34, 21% of the time saying they stream their games, falling off quite dramatically when you get to the 35 to 54s, only 6% streaming games. And again, with those older people pretty much just saying meh, 2%. Meh. Now on to our social media section and back to Tom. Oh, one quick reminder, don't forget we have a hashtag Infinite Dial. If you're tweeting or otherwise socializing about our presentation today, please use the hashtag.
Super. Thanks, John. So we've been tracking social media for a long time. I think this is probably the longest continuously running study of social media consumption in the United States as well. And if we look at general overall social media usage, in 2008, it was about 10% of the population 12 plus. Today, it's ticked up a little bit. 82% of Americans 12 plus use social media. As a point of comparison, about 90% of us have internet access. So it is something that if you are able to use it in some way, shape, or form, you're very likely to be using social media. And you're very likely to be using Facebook, which of course continues to be the #1 platform. Here we're looking at awareness with Facebook leading the pack But really all of these, especially the top 5, enormously high awareness: Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, and now TikTok, all over 85%, all exceeding the percentage of the population that could actually, almost reaching the percentage of the population that could actually even use these. And of course, this is the second year that we have tracked TikTok, and we'll have some interesting observations when we get to that. In terms of the trending of all of these, most things seem fairly stable, at least in terms of awareness. You will see here that TikTok had quite a bump in awareness over last year. Last year, 64% of the population were aware of TikTok. This year it's 86. They've certainly had their day in the news and their day on other social media platforms, such as Twitter. See a little bit of growth here for WhatsApp. And then, of course, the debut of Parler, or as my high school French teacher, Madame Goff, would insist, Parlay, which I believe they launched as Parlay, but now they're Parler. 40% of Americans 12 plus are familiar with Parler. And I'm going to show you use here in a moment. And, as I mentioned at the top of the webinar today, the Infinite Dial has been around since 1998. And so I went back, John, and I looked at the top social networks in the first year of the Infinite Dial. And some of them surprised me. Some of them I think we still use today.
What were they?
Was, I'm going to give you just the top 3 or 4 here. Number 1 was the Psychic Friends Network with Dionne Warwick, which I believe is still fairly popular. I know there's a bit of a Dionnaissance.
The problem was that was like $9.95 a minute, though, wasn't it, to use that social network?
I can tell you exactly how much it was, John, but I'll need to consult my records. Number 2 was Really Long Phone Cord back in 98. That was a pretty big one. And then the number 3, which I know you and I used to do a lot back when we first met, is faxparty.com.
Well, number 4 was, of course, going out and seeing people, which we've totally forgotten how to do.
That just sounds horrifying to me. So let's go ahead and get to usage here. In terms of overall usage, Facebook is at 61.
They have to go register faxparty.com just in case something
it's
good
too
comes
late. Yeah, I already registered Faxinar, which I think is a better way to deliver this, but thanks for hanging in there. In terms of overall usage, once again, Facebook leads the pack at 61% of the population. Instagram is a strong second here at 43. Pinterest, Snapchat, and now Twitter and TikTok are tied. I think Twitter had a bit of a head start there. So TikTok has indeed had a consequential year. And then Parler bringing up the rear here at 5%. In terms of the trending of all of that, Facebook is relatively flat, at least on the surface. I'm going to show you some data in a moment that actually shows that there's a fair amount of churn under that surface, even though the number looks flat. We do see growth in Instagram. We see growth in Twitter. Certainly a big surge in TikTok from 11% usage last year to 23% usage this year. And Parler at 5% again in its debut. Breaking that down demographically, here's where you start to see the numbers behind the apparent flat trending on Facebook. You can see Facebook with 12 to 34-year-olds declined from 64% to 57%. TikTok had an incredible surge, really, from 25% to 44%. And something, if you are a frequent Twitter user, which I am, you probably see a lot of TikTok videos, even if you don't even have a TikTok account. And that's certainly true, frankly, with Twitter as well. People see or hear of tweets, even if they don't use the service. So both of those services, I think, punch above their weight a little bit. 35 to 54, again, a little bit of a decline with Facebook, a bit of a decline with Pinterest as well, but you do continue to see gains with Instagram, Snapchat, pretty decent gain here with Twitter. It's at 35 to 54 from 17% 2 years ago to 25% now. And then, of course, Parler at the bottom at 8. And then finally, 55 and older. Here's where you see growth with Facebook from 52% of 55 and older to 57%. That's where you actually see a little bit of growth. And also some growth in Instagram. More and more people really got on board using Instagram in the past year. And you're going to see that even more in the next couple of slides, because one of the questions that we like to ask people, of all of the brands that you use, what is the social media brand you use most often? And this is amongst social media users 12 plus. And this is really a first in the history of the Infinite Dial. This is the first time that a majority of social media users did not say Facebook. was the brand that they use the most. 47%, of course, say that Facebook is the brand that they use the most. But Instagram now, a very strong second at 18%. And you can see TikTok there at the bottom has gone from essentially nothing 2 years ago to now 7% of social media users 12 plus saying it's the brand that they use most often. And that those demographics get very sharply defined, I think. 12 to 34. Facebook is certainly not number one anymore. Instagram, by far, the number one service in terms of used most often with 12 to 34-year-olds. But there's two things really that I think this graph should highlight. Number one, just how much the behaviors of 12 to 34-year-olds differ from those 35 and older. But also number two, just how strong Facebook continues to be 35 plus. We certainly did see growth 55 plus, but 35 plus, we see that Facebook is still overwhelmingly the social media brand that people use most often.
It's also interesting to note, though, that Facebook is not just Facebook. They own some of these other companies as well, like Instagram and Snapchat, right?
Yeah, and it's what's kind of interesting, though, is just how much TikTok has been a fly in the ointment there. Mm-hmm. If you look at those three combined, in 2021, at least with 12 to 34-year-olds, it's nearly what they used to be in 2016. Instagram has taken up a lot more of that share, certainly in the last 3 years. And of course, TikTok, again, coming from essentially nothing a couple of years ago to 14% of 12 to 34-year-olds saying it's the brand they use most often. And these trends are much more gradual when you look at the next two age demographics. With 35 to 54-year-olds, 60% again say Facebook is the brand that they use most often. And where you see really the trend here is towards Instagram. Things like Twitter, Pinterest, not really grown in share in this question so much in the last 5 or 6 years. But certainly Instagram has, going from 2% indicating Instagram back in 2016 to 10% now. And then finally with 55 plus, you see less movement overall. Facebook really retaining its dominance as the number one social media platform with 55 and older. So that's a quick look, a quick survey course at the global social media trends, I guess. And by the way, as we always indicate every year, there's a lot of data in the Infinite Dial data set. We will be coming out with future reports. Today is really meant to be a quick overview of the most important trends. And there are a few more important trends to look at in the Infinite Dial than online audio. And with that, I'll turn things back to my friend, John Rosso.
My favorite part of the Infinite Dial, the online audio section. First, remember that for the purposes of the Infinite Dial, online audio is defined as the streams of AM/FM stations and other audio available only on the internet. So let's jump in. First, online audio, monthly online audio listening, now plateauing at about 68%, flat to last year, about 193 million people, plateauing after many, many years of steady growth. The most striking thing about this chart, when I first looked at it, really was the number of data points that are on it, or the number of data. This is the one time a year when Tom gets to remind me that data is actually plural. But the data here, just showing us how many years the Infinite Dial has been tracking this stat, now 21 years.
Thank you for pluralizing data. And also just a quick correction, as some of you were, thank you for pointing it out. Facebook, of course, owns Facebook and Instagram.
Thank you.
Yes. So just
did I say Instagram? No, what did I say? Instagram and
Snapchat.
WhatsApp. Yeah, WhatsApp.
Yeah. Sorry. I've really had a lot of water today. Continue, John.
Moving on. Here we look at that same set of trends, but broken out demographically. Now, remember, the average was 68% listening monthly for the 12 plus population. It's interesting to see that both the 12 to 34 and 35 to 54s are above average here. The 12 to 34 is hanging about flat, 86%. 35-54 is down just a touch from 76 to 72%. And overall, the old people dragging the average down, but even amongst the older people, consumption growing actually pretty nicely from 42% to 46% monthly, the highest ever there, and still a very significant portion of the population. Now let's look at the weekly consumption of online audio. A small increase after a couple of years of holding steady, going up from 60% to 62%, or about 176 million people. And now one of the more interesting slides, the average time spent listening to online audio, at least more interesting to me, with a pretty significant 7% increase up this year from 15 hours and 12 minutes a week to 16 hours and 14 minutes a week. We dug into some other data to try to confirm this. We went and looked at some Triton webcast metrics data and pulled time spent listening over the same period of time, and actually saw growth that was just above 6%. So very, very close correlation between the infinite dial and what we're seeing in Triton census level data. And with that, I will send it back to Tom to take us through online audio brands.
Thanks, John. So we're going to look at some of the biggest brands in online audio. Of course, we track many, and have over the years. And we'll start with awareness. And Pandora continues to lead as the brand most people are aware of, which not a surprise. They were really early on in the space, certainly one of the first to have apps on Apple and Android. Number 2 here is Spotify. And again, we're really talking about online audio brands here. And there are certainly a lot of brands here that are at or above 50%. Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Amazon Music, Google Play. Down at the bottom in terms of awareness, you'll see Tidal at 12%. I'll note that we fielded this just before Jay-Z sold Tidal to Jack Dorsey at Square. So it's something that we'll continue to keep an eye on. And of course, we've been tracking the usage of these brands since all the way back in 1998. And you know what, John?
Sorry, I'm muting. What, Tom?
I went back to 1998 and I looked at the top 3.
In the infinite dial time machine?
In the infinite dial time machine. I do that every night. And the top 3 brands in the 1998 infinite dial, number 1 was KTEL.
Oh, yes.
Remember KTEL?
Yes, I do. Yes. I still have a subscription.
I do too. Yeah. It's every year. They bill me. Number 2, of course, was Columbia House. And number 3 was Freedom Rock. Turn it up.
Awesome.
Anyway, online audio brands, Spotify a clear number 1, Pandora and Google Play, which is YouTube Music, tied for second, followed by Amazon, Apple, iHeart, and SoundCloud. And that's in the last week. And just one thing that I'll note about that before I push on, Spotify here, in terms of a single brand, the largest online audio brand. And of course, you go down through, there's Pandora, which of course combines in the same company with SoundCloud and SiriusXM and some others. So all of these brands are forming very interesting platforms. But in terms of weekly listening, Spotify, absolutely the top brand in terms of the last week. As we did with social media, we like to ask which brands are used most often. And here Spotify is the number 1 choice. 31% of those who are 12 and up who use any online audio brand say that Spotify is the brand they use most often. Of course, that means that 69% say that it is not. And amongst that group, you'll see Pandora, Google Play, Apple, Amazon, and iHeart. Last year, we took a look at these data by people who owned an Amazon Alexa device. And you can see that really does drive usage of Amazon Music. Amazon Music here, a strong number 2 amongst those who own an Amazon Alexa device, as it certainly works well when it's connected to Amazon. Interestingly, when we looked at the same data by those who own a Google Nest device, it did not necessarily translate into Google being the service that people use most often. I guess as long as they have your data, John.
Right.
Use what you want.
They've already gotten it. They don't care whose music you're listening to.
Exactly. And so with Google Nest, 50% use Spotify. And that's going to bring us, we asked for some user submitted questions here. And I'm just quickly going to make sure that I, in fact, have James's sound called up. And yes, I do. We asked some people to submit some video questions. And our first one is from the editor of Pod News. I think many people reading this now certainly read Pod News every day, James Cridland.
I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News. Now, recently there was some data from someone else suggesting that Spotify will overtake Apple Podcasts for total US audience in 2021. John, Tom, what say you?
So my take on this is, first, it's appalling that James would be talking about someone else's data. That's my first take on this. So I'm not even so sure we should answer his question after that. But we did a little research, James, and we did that by looking into some of the Triton webcast metrics data for the last year or so. I think, by the way, that you're referring to an eMarketer report that showed that Spotify would pass Apple this year, and they showed that Spotify was growing very rapidly, but had Apple pretty much flat out into the future. They didn't source that particular data very well, so I'm not sure what the basis was for it. But looking at the Triton data, what we saw at the beginning of 2020 was they were pretty close. Apple and Spotify were actually very close, and Spotify was growing faster until fourth quarter of last year, when Spotify's growth slowed down and they actually started to decline a bit. So at the moment, they're still very close, but Apple is outgrowing Spotify once again, at least in the data that we see. Thank you for your question, James.
Thanks, James. And I have to go back to what John's point was at the start of this about seeing other data. Betrayal, John?
We never discussed that. We never discussed seeing other data.
I think betrayal is kind of where I am there.
Tom, I can't do this anymore.
I can't either. Let's just go to a slide. So one of the things that we asked in terms of the various audio brands is how often do you listen to audio with other people? And this is a new question in the Infinite Dial. And what we discovered was more than half of the total population say they listen to audio at least sometimes with other people. And that is very relevant to online audio. That means every time someone is listening to online audio or audio of any kind, there are greater than one person listening to it, right, John? There's some fraction of that. And there's definitely a demographic lean to that. You're more likely to say that you listen to audio with other people when you're 12 to 34. And I know certainly my son, I have a teenager, and he listens to music on Discord servers with his friends, because again, in-person music listening has taken a bit of a hit, a bit of a damper, thanks to a 10 nanometer particle this year.
In my family, we like to gather around the smart speaker and listen to murder podcasts.
Like murdering Tom Webster, the co-host of the Infinite Dial, which I understand is number 3 on Apple Podcasts this week. So, but I'm back for another season. So in speaking of listening in groups, in car is certainly an aspect that we've been tracking on the Infinite Dial for many, many years now. And we can certainly listen to audio in groups in the car. John, why don't you take us through sort of the highlights of in-car media this year?
Got it. So remember, the first thing about in-car media is that to consume it, you have to actually be in a car. And of course, being in a car, in this past year for commuting to work purposes is probably greatly reduced. So let's actually start with the number of people who say they've been in a car recently. And this chart shows us the percentage of people 18 plus who have driven or ridden in a car in the last month. That number usually bounces around the high 80s, but in this pandemic year, we saw a bit of a decline from 87% to 83%. Now, of course, 83% is still a relatively high number, but we should expect some impact on media consumption. One thing to think about when looking at these data is how various segments of the population may have been differentially impacted and how that might be driving changes in consumption patterns. Beep. Here we have audio sources currently ever used in car. First, at the top, AM/FM radio is down just a bit from 81 to 75, but still number 1 by far. Let's now jump all the way down to the bottom and look at satellite radio, which was down more significantly from 24% to 21%. That's about a 13% decrease. Owned digital music and online audio were steady at 48 and 33% respectively. And then our old friend, the venerable old CD player, decreasing from 41% to 35%. Tom, it seems like every year we have to tell this story about the CD player declining.
I know, and sadly, the inventor of the cassette tape just died. I don't know if you thought.
Yes, I heard about that.
Inventor of the cassette tape, and cassettes are weirdly back, and have been for a few years now. So that's all.
I can't wait till 8-tracks come back. I still have a player in my car. The big winner here, the only in-car medium growing this year, is podcasts, which increased from 28% to 30%. Now we can go on. Turning to ownership of in-dash entertainment, information and entertainment systems. So that would be something other than, radio or radio plus CD player, maybe radio plus Dead Guy's tape player. Or in Tom's case, that sweet 8-track combo unit that I know he's still got. The number of people owning these more sophisticated in-dash units has grown from 18% to 20%. Now, that's despite new car sales being significantly off last year, but it's probably safe to assume that just about any new car purchased in the past year came equipped with one of these systems, so that's why the increase this year. And now on to integrated mobile operating systems. If you open up the Tom Webster's dictionary, you will find that he invented this term, IMOS, integrated mobile operating systems. These are the systems that allow you to connect and control your mobile device from the dashboard head unit. The big players here are obvious. Those would be Apple and Android, with 10% having the Apple CarPlay system and 8% having Android Auto. And once you've connected your mobile device to the dash unit, what do? Well, one of the things you do is listen to online audio. This is a behavior that increased pretty significantly this year, following a big increase in 2020, going 41 to 45%, now to 50%, or half of the 12 plus population having ever listened to online audio through their cell phone in a car. Once again, just a reminder that we've got a hashtag. It's infinite dial. Pound or hash infinite dial if you are tweeting about us. That concludes our look at in-car media. And now, podcasting. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, John. So like John and Triton, we saw some interesting changes in digital audio throughout the past 12 months. And it's been an unusual 12 months, to say the least. Had we put the infinite dial out in May, for instance, it would have looked very, very different. We certainly saw big drops in a lot of forms of audio, podcasting included, at the very beginning of the pandemic, when 80% of the population was watching Tiger King. Pour one out for Tiger King, for those of you who remember that, which is now, I think, second on the charts after Murder on the Infinite Dial, which I think we're taking straight to number one after today. One of the things that we discovered fairly quickly, though, was that once that initial disruption was over, audio of all forms came really roaring back, especially podcasting. And now we're going to look at where we are at the end of 12 months from last year's Infinite Dial in terms of podcasting usage and familiarity. So we'll start with familiarity. This is the percentage of Americans 12 plus who are familiar with the term podcasting. And today that is 78%. That's up from 75% last year. So certainly more than 3/4 of the U.S. population is familiar with the term podcasting and generally know what it is. There is certainly a gap in there, that gap between the percentage who are familiar with the term and the percentage of people who say they've ever listened to a podcast. And they can have some beliefs about podcasting that are potentially misinformed or mistaken or have not been communicated well enough to them. But that's familiarity. And I mentioned the gap between familiarity and usage. Today, 57% of Americans 12 plus say they've ever listened to a podcast. So well over half now of the U.S. population. That's an estimated 162 million Americans who say they've ever listened to a podcast. So it's well into the mainstream, certainly as it has been for years. And again, we have been tracking this since all the way back in 2006. So it's sort of a nice tableau, I think.
Sorry, I was laughing at Hernan Lopez's comment in the chat, which is that 80% of those people actually have their own podcasts.
Well, we don't track that, but I believe he's correct. I believe anecdotally. And as we all know, data is the plural of anecdote. So we're going to say that that's correct. Here's some big news, though. Monthly podcast listening is up, and it's up reasonably significantly here, from 37% of the U.S. population 12 plus to 41%. 41% of Americans 12 plus say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. That's 116 million Americans, John. So podcasting come a long way. More than 4 in 10 listened in the last month.
Indeed.
So that's going to bring us to another listener question. And this is a question from Brian Barletta, who writes the Sounds Profitable newsletter, which is not only a fantastic newsletter to which I subscribe. It's one of the best educational resources, I think, on ad tech and monetizing podcasts that's out there. So
Are we picking people who write newsletters in a shameless attempt at promotion? Is that what we're doing?
yes, the third question's mine. No, we would never shamelessly promote people's newsletters. Brian's is a good
Well, I
one.
meant us. We get to get them to shamelessly promote us.
100%. But we're here to promote Brian. Brian, thanks for being a loyal Infinite Dial listener. Go ahead with your question.
What's one piece of information that the public misinterpreted from the 2020 Infinite Dial that you'd like to make sure we get right this time around?
That's a good one. I have a general one. I know, John, I think you're going to talk about something a little bit more specific. My general, if I had a complaint about you, dear listeners, and they are very, very few, it's mistaking percent for percentage. When something goes from 37% to 41%, I will sometimes see that written as an increase of only 4%. It is no such thing. It is an increase of 4 percentage points, but that's not percent, obviously. So, John, what's the thing that people misinterpret the most to you?
So, and you'll see this chart in just in a few minutes, but every year we put up a slide that answers the question, how many podcasts do you listen to in a week? And it's not been quite clear to people whether that was how many different podcast shows or how many episodes or some combination of the two. So that's been a bit misinterpreted, and we will attempt to bring clarity this year in just a few slides. And thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, clarity is on the way, which I'm very excited about. All right, so on to our next podcasting stat, and we're going to look here at the percentage of men and the percentage of women who tell us they have listened to a podcast in the last month. And again, these are not share or composition graphs. This is not saying that 43% of podcast listeners are men. It is saying that 43% of men have listened to a podcast in the last month, and 39% of women have listened to a podcast in the last month. Both have grown year over year. And where we see continued growth is 12 to 34. And really, that continues to be the biggest story in recent growth in podcasting. 34% of 12 to 34-year-olds just 4 years ago were monthly podcast listeners. Today, it's now over half of 12 to 34-year-olds say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. 35 to 54 looked a bit flat year over year, but 55 plus saw a nice increase from 22% to 26% in terms of the percentage by age who have listened to a podcast in the last month. Now, if we compare the gender of monthly podcast consumers to the U.S. population, we see it's getting pretty darn close. In the U.S., 48% of the population identify as men, 49% women, 2% non-binary or other. And with podcasting, it's getting pretty close to that. And it has year after year after year. Certainly 15 years ago, it was about 2/3 men. So every year that gets a little bit more, I think, gender equitable, at least compared to the U.S. population. And we also see that when we look at the composition in terms of the number of people in each one of these cells. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because this shows how the the age composition of podcasting has changed from 2011 to 2016 to 2021. And if you just look at the composition, you can see the blue bar on the right has been getting larger and larger. That's the 55 plus bar. All that means really is that the monthly podcast consumer is getting closer and closer to the U.S. population, because certainly that bar is larger with the U.S. population. So 21% of monthly podcast consumers are now 55 plus, but half are 12 to 34. And you'll see that we've also put estimated population figures on this, because even the things that look like they haven't changed much, for instance, the 12 to 34 age composition, while the composition, the share aspect has gone from 46 to 50, look at the actual numbers of humans that make up those buckets. And back in 2011, that was 14 million 12 to 34-year-olds. Today, it's 58 million 12 to 34-year-olds. So again, even where these composition bars look like they haven't changed a great deal, There's enormous growth happening in all of these buckets. We've also seen podcasting get less white. Just 10 years ago, 68% of monthly podcast consumers identified as white. Today, that's 57%, which means that 43% identify as non-white. And that is actually more diverse than the U.S. population. The U.S. population currently is about 60% white. And really what's driving some of that is the youth of the podcasting audience and how strong it is 12 to 34. Because even though about 60% of the U.S. population identifies as white, 50% of those 16 and under are white. So the younger parts of our population are certainly less and less likely to identify as white as we move forward with census data. So podcasting getting a lot more diverse. And then to me, this is, tied for the biggest, second biggest or biggest stat really in the whole presentation. And that is the growth in weekly podcast consumption from 24% of the U.S. population 12 plus to 28%. That's now 80 million Americans 12 plus. And I know it was just a couple of years ago at Podcast Movement 2018 where I talked about getting to 100 million weekly podcast consumers. And well, we've certainly made incredible jumps and strides in getting there, even just in the past year. So today, 28% of the U.S. population 12 plus have listened to a podcast in the last week. We've certainly got a lot of daily podcasts that have driven frequency, but really it's podcasts of all genres and topics that are driving this. John mentioned earlier, one of the stats that people often get confused or misinterpret when they look at our data is the difference between really shows and episodes. So I'm going to show you both here as we wrap things up on the Infinite Dial. First, in terms of the number of episodes or individual podcasts that people listen to in the last week, if you are a weekly podcast consumer, you listen to an average of 8. And if 19% say actually 11 or more, and another 19%, 6 to 10, certainly, again, daily podcasts, daily topical podcasts and daily news podcasts have had something to do with that, but don't explain all of it. So we typically listen to about 8 podcast episodes per week, and those are typically drawn from just a skosh over 5 individual podcasts per week.
Is that a technical research term, skosh? Is that like...
Skosh is a real word. If you look it up in your Webster's dictionary, I will be vindicated, even though earlier I was murdered. You will find that. So we listen to, if you're a weekly podcast consumer, 5 podcast shows per week. And on those 5 podcast shows, that works out to about 8 episodes. So again, some of that could be daily news podcasts. Some of that could be, binge listening to shows that have multiple episodes available. Some of that could just be catching up on old podcasts. But 5 individual podcast shows per week and 8 episodes per week is the current consumption of the weekly podcast consumer. And that's going to bring us to our last video question. And this is from Liz Horwitz.
I'm curious to know why you think we're still saying wherever you get your podcasts. And wouldn't it make more sense to say something like listen for free anywhere?
Well, she's got a point there, John. What do you think?
She does. I don't know why we say that. I guess you just want people to know that you can get the content anywhere. I do, however, like that phrase "listen for free" because as many people have commented in the past, the term "subscribe" to many people suggests you have to pay for it. Now I know subscribe is hopefully going away here in favor of follow or some other things, but I do love listen for free as a reminder that most of podcasting is free, at least in terms of cash.
Yeah, and I will point out here some research that we put out a couple of years ago where we interviewed people who were familiar with the term podcasting but had not yet listened to a podcast. And that's a little over 20% of the U.S. population, by the way. And amongst that group of people, 47% believed that subscribing to a podcast costs money because for many people, subscriptions cost money, right? You subscribe to a magazine, you subscribe to Netflix, you subscribe to the Fruit of the Month Club if you like monthly fruit. But that term subscription certainly has been confusing to people that are not yet podcast listeners. And I think we are starting to see more and more, with the exception of YouTube, a trend towards follow, which of course opens up the possibility of subscribe coming back, but actually meaning subscribe in terms of paying for a podcast. All right. So we're going to finish off here with our observations. Just a reminder again, the hashtag is Infinite Dial. If we did not get to answer your question in the Q&A box, rest assured we will get back with you. Our incredible team, it takes a village of severals here at Edison Research and Triton Digital to put this together, so we will get back in touch with you. But in terms of the overall trends here, first of all, podcasting has grown significantly, especially with weekly listeners. That bump in weekly consumers is actually surprising me just a touch to the high side. And I'm rarely surprised by data, but I think that was a pretty strong showing.
And the demographics of podcast listeners continues to diversify. In 2021, the composition of female listeners reached an all-time high. Thank you, Rita Coolidge. While podcast consumers continue to be mostly white, the medium exhibited very strong gains with Hispanic/Latino listeners and with Black listeners. And most importantly, podcast audiences now very nearly reflect the diversity of the U.S. population.
We've seen tablets and watches plateau. Those really have not ticked up really in the last 3 or 4 years. The smartphone really continues to grow. The smartphone is the dominant device for media consumption.
Smartphone ownership grew more than 22% year over year. Now 33% owning. The number of speakers per home also grew. Pandemic-related restrictions may have helped to fuel this growth, with nearly half of those who primarily work from home now owning a smart speaker.
That's smart speaker growth there at the beginning. And of course, we've all had to change the names of our smart speakers so that we can mention them aloud in the webinar. Most social media platforms grew kind of modestly. There was Facebook appears to have plateaued a little bit, but there was some churn in the demographics. TikTok, however, did surge, especially with 12 to 34-year-olds. And for the first time in Infinite Dial history, Facebook is no longer indicated by the majority of social media users as the most used platform. And that's really driven by 12 to 34-year-olds migrating more and more to Instagram and TikTok and to some extent Snapchat.
And 1 in 5 Americans 12 plus have now watched a live stream of a video game, and 10% have actually broadcast their own game. So Tom, I'll see you on Call of Duty later.
I will see you on Call of Duty later. Weekly online audio listening has hit an all-time high, and we've seen not only an increase in reach, but also a 1-hour increase in the weekly time spent listening over the previous year. And again, as I mentioned before, had we done the Infinite Dial in May, it might have looked very different. But it did not take long for audio patterns to resettle back to not only where they were, but actually at a higher level.
And Spotify has solidified its spot as the largest single source for online audio and has played a role in the growth of podcasting, especially with younger listeners.
And the percentage of Americans who have driven or ridden a car in the last month decreased. And that was, again, one of those things that would have been even lower had we done this in the summer. I don't own a car, John, and I had to look at my Uber receipts. It's been November since I was in a car. It's been November. So it's certainly been several months since I have even sniffed the leather, at least of a car. And that's, again, largely due to pandemic-related disruptions. And that is going to wrap up the Infinite Dial. Just a quick reminder, we have more coming. We have the Infinite Dial Australia that is coming up in the fall for our folks down under, but in the spring for us here in America. Moms in Media is coming up. That'll be close to Mother's Day. The Infinite Dial Canada will be coming out very soon. And we will be sharing more and more data from this edition of the Infinite Dial in some ancillary reports as we move forward, because we have collected a lot of data. So with that, that's going to bring this year to a close, John. I think it started as a very strange year, and I think has ended reassuringly normal looking, at least from the Infinite Dial's perspective.
Yes, the stability that we've seen in terms of a lot of these consumption patterns is actually quite reassuring.
So we're going to wrap things up here. We've taken your time and attention, and thank you for that gift for nearly an hour. And I know that many of you have to get back home, and you are. Thanks again for listening.
One quick note of thanks to the entire Edison team, as always, for unbelievable work, and of course to the Triton team, especially Kristen Sharon. Thank you from me.
Yes, and thank you to Laura, Megan, Nicole, Susie, and Larry on our side. As I said, it takes a village of severals, and they all contribute to making this a work that we're all proud of. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.